Okay, so for the next topic under module number 5 still, so we will discuss about audit risk model. Okay, so audit risk can be expressed mathematically using the following formula. So AR is the audit risk for the account. That is equal to IR, or inherent risk, multiplied by the control risk and detection risk. So this is how the auditor will estimate the amount or the degree or the level of audit risk. Okay, so this can also be represented as follows. So your audit risk is equal to risk of material misstatement. So again, RMM is inherent risk times control risk. This is on the part of the management. So multiplied by the detection risk. So this is just the same as the first formula that we have in the previous slide. So audit risk may be assessed quantitatively. Normally it is in terms of percentage, or it can be qualitatively. Okay, so qualitatively meaning low, moderate, and high. But using percentage can also be more specific and quantifiable. So for instance, an auditor may set the control risk at 70% or 30%, or alternatively state that the control risk is at high or maximum level, or low or below maximum level. Okay, so this is what we have mentioned a while ago, either quantitatively or qualitative expression of the audit risk. So to illustrate, we have here an example. Okay, so we have, if the inherent risk is 80%, control risk is 50%, and detection risk is 40%, then audit risk is equal to, okay, applying the formula, that's 16%. Okay, so this is the level of audit risk that may be acceptable. So depending on the basis in which the auditor will relate, okay, this audit risk, so he can classify it as either low, high, or moderate. Okay, because of the inherent limitations of the audit, the auditor could not reduce the audit risk to zero. So that is what we are talking about before, where the auditor can only reduce the risk, but he cannot eliminate it totally. So there are always some risks that the assertions are susceptible to misstatements, okay, that the client's internal controls may not be able to prevent the misstatements, or the auditor himself may fail to detect such material misstatements. Okay, so hence, the auditor should plan and perform the audit to reduce this audit risk to an acceptably low level. How can he do that? By designing and performing audit procedures to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, so that he may be able to express reasonable opinion or conclusion in which to base, okay, that opinion. So acceptable level of audit risk. So here, acceptable level of audit risk, this refers to the amount of the risk that the auditor is willing to accept. So normally in practice, the auditor will usually predetermine an acceptable or desired level of audit risk, and he will also ascertain the acceptable level of detection risk based on the assessed level of inherent and control risk. Meaning to say, in this case, the auditor will assess, okay, the inherent risk, the level of inherent risk and control risk, and then based on the result of the assessment, he can modify the level of detection risk, in which this level of detection risk will result into acceptable level of overall audit risk. Okay, so because in this case, as mentioned before, the only risk that the auditor can control is the detection risk. Inherent and control risk is on the part of the management. So in that case, the auditor will assess it, okay, and then here he can control the detection risk whether to make it high, moderate, or low, so that the result of the audit risk will be considered acceptable or below the acceptable level. Okay, so this is embodied in the following equation. So by the way, this is just we derive, okay, this equation from the first formula that we introduced in the audit risk model. Okay, so DR, or detection risk, is equal to our audit risk divided by inherent risk multiplied by control risk. So if you could still remember, okay, the formula, we just derived the detection risk. So this is how the auditor will determine the level of detection risk that he is willing to accept, so that the audit risk will be minimized to acceptably low level, or to the acceptable level. Okay, so in this video lecture, we will continue with the relationship among the audit risk components. Okay, so the risk of material misstatement, or inherent risk and control risk, these are the functions of the client or the management, as mentioned before, and its environment. So they exist independently of the audit, meaning even before the audit have been engaged, there has already inherent and control risk that may exist in the client entity's organization or environment. So detection risk, on the other hand, is the function of the effectiveness of the audit procedures and the application of it by the auditor, and therefore can be changed by the auditor's discretion. So this is what we are talking about earlier, about where the auditor can control this detection risk. Detection risk, however, can only be reduced, but again, it cannot be totally eliminated because of the inherent limitations also of the audit. So accordingly, some detection risk will always be present, even though it's very minimal, but still there is audit or detection risk that may exist. So the risk during the audit, the auditor will plan and perform the audit procedures to determine the assessed levels of inherent and control risk. So this is what we have mentioned also a while ago, where the auditor will predetermine or assess preliminarily the level of inherent and control risk that exists in the entity's environment. So the PSA typically refer to risk of material misstatement rather than inherent and control risk separately. So that's why, if you could notice, we used the term risk of material misstatement, although the component is or includes inherent and control risk. However, in PSA 315, so this is revised in 2019, so this requires inherent risk to be assessed separately from that of the control risk, because they have this different nature, to provide the basis for designing and performing further audit procedures to respond to assessed risk of material misstatement. So the point here is that although we are using this term, risk of material misstatement, for these two types of risk, but when it comes to assessment, they will be assessed separately by the auditor. Okay, for illustration purposes, there is an inverse relationship between the acceptable level of detection risk and risk of material misstatement for account. So why is that so? Okay, if the risk of material misstatement is assessed to be high, the detection risk should be low. Okay, what is the meaning of this? Okay, meaning, based on the assessment of the auditor, the control and inherent risk in the entity is too high or high. So in order for the total audit risk to be minimized or reduced, the detection risk should also be lower. How to lower the detection risk? By doing more substantive procedures or further audit procedures so that the auditor will detect more misstatements that may exist in the FS. That is the meaning of this inverse relationship. Okay, again, because there are more material misstatements that may exist or that exist in the financial statements, so the auditor should do more substantive procedures and do more audit procedures to detect more misstatements so that audit risk will be minimized. Okay, so for instance, if the account under the audit is highly susceptible to fraud or errors, okay, for example, cash account, and the client's internal control in handling such account is somewhat ineffective as well. So the auditor should minimize the risk that he will fail to detect material misstatements to be able to maintain the planned audit risk. Meaning, since the nature of cash is highly susceptible to risk and the internal control is ineffective, so in order for the auditor to minimize the overall audit risk, he should do more audit procedures to detect more misstatement in cash account. That is lowering his detection risk. Okay, so conversely, if the assessed level, on the other hand, is low, then the auditor can accept high level of detection risk. What is the meaning of this? Meaning, if the inherent risk and control risk is low, meaning there is lesser inherent risk in that particular account or transaction or disclosure, the internal control of the management is effective. Okay, so in this case, the auditor will somewhat have he can accept a higher detection risk, okay, and still have lower or acceptable overall audit risk. Okay, so meaning if there is less inherent risk and the controls are effective, the auditor will perform substantive tests without further doing audit procedures, okay, because these are already considered to be effective. Okay, so he can rely on the internal control that it is effective. So his detection risk, he can accept it at a high level. Okay, so substantive procedures are procedures designed to detect material misstatements on the FS. So that's why this is what the auditor is doing, okay, to further detect the misstatements. So there is an inverse relationship between acceptable level of detection risk and the assurance provided from the procedures. So how is that so? Okay, for example, as the acceptable level of detection risk decrease, okay, the assurance provided from substantive procedure should increase. Meaning, if in this case, the auditor should or the auditor can only accept low level of detection risk, so how can he do that? He should do more substantive procedures. That's why this is increased, okay, to minimize the detection risk, meaning so that he will be able to detect more misstatements by doing more substantive procedures. Okay, so the auditor may also do the following. Okay, change the nature of substantive procedures by using more effective procedures by performing them at year-end rather than at interim date, because in this case, at year-end, it is normally where the transactions have already completed. They are already completed and the data can somehow be complete as well. So he can also change the extent of the substantive procedure by examining larger samples, okay, of the items. So doing more substantive and audit procedures to reduce audit risk. Okay, in contrast, as the acceptable level of detection risk increase, so the assurance provided from substantive procedures will decrease. Okay, so in this case, detection risk is high, meaning the auditor is able to accept more detection risk. So meaning the auditor will do lesser substantive procedures. Okay, because he is able to accept higher level of detection risk. So in this case, the auditor will do the following. You can do the following. This is just the opposite of the first one. So here, he can use less effective procedures. He will do substantive procedures in interim dates, meaning just a sample of the transaction or the account balance without waiting for it to be completed at the end of the year. And he can also uh, change the extent of substantive procedures by examining smaller sample of the items, because in this case, he will do lesser substantive procedures because he is able to accept more detection risk or higher detection risk. So materiality and audit risk are considered also throughout the audit. So this is when the auditor identifies and assess the risk of material misstatement. So only those material items will be considered. In determining also in the nature, timing, and extent of further audit procedures, depending on the level of the audit risk that the auditor is able to accept, and to evaluate the effect of the unrecorded or uncorrected misstatements on the FS, and also informing his opinion on the FS. So there is an inverse relationship between materiality level and the level of audit risk. So for example, if the auditor determines that the acceptable materiality level is low, then the audit risk should be assessed at high level. So here, the nature, timing, and extent of substantive procedure should be modified accordingly. Meaning, if materiality is low, for example, 100 the amount of 100 is considered material. So meaning to say, even the small amount is material. So basically, audit risk is high because even in the smaller amount, that is already considered to be material. So in this case, there should be more substantive procedures that will be done by the auditor to reduce that overall audit risk to an acceptable level. Okay. Okay, so that is for the materiality and audit risk, or the relationship between the audit risk variables.